Hello everyone and welcome back to RubberStamps.com. Today we are continuing in our practice prompt series. This is part of a series that we're doing here to practice some of the skills that we need for card making. This practice prompt today is going to be all about textures. Here are all of the supplies that you're going to need to follow along today. If you don't have some of this, that's okay. Just skip the parts that you don't have supplies for and follow along for the parts that you do. So today we're going to need watercolor paints, memories mists, clear embossing ink, clear embossing powder, textured paper, a pattern stamp, and your clear acrylic block. So the first technique that we're going to be doing today is using the memories mists to create a splattered look on the paper. To use this, shake it really well first, remove the cap, and when you're using this, it comes out really quickly. So one thing to keep in mind is that depending on how high you have the bottle and how close it is to the paper, it's going to determine how much of a splatter you get. So if you're really close to the paper, it will look like this. So you can see how the splatter is really close together. That's a fun texture. And the further away you take it, so you bring it all the way back here, you can see that now it's a wider spread. They're farther apart. You have more of these distinct blue dots, the darker blue, versus this all being a very similar shade with only these two darker dots. You have a lot more darker dots spread out more if you pull this farther away from the paper. The next technique is another splatter technique. For this one, we're going to be using watercolor paints. This is a really easy technique for you to do at home. You can do it with whatever brand of watercolor paints that you have on hand. It doesn't have to be the high-end brands. It could even be your kids' Crayola watercolor paint set. That's totally fine. So what you're going to do is get your brush fully saturated with water and paint and take your finger and flick. You have to do it a few times, repeating to get a wider spread. You can see that it's not as dark as using the mist, but it's still another really great option for creating a splattered look. And you can vary how dark it is based on how much water you have on the brush. So actually, if you have more water, it's going to create darker, bigger splatters. Less water, it's not quite as easy, but that can be useful as well. So those are the first two techniques creating a splattered texture. All right, and the next technique that we have is using a pattern stamp. A few things to note with this pattern stamp. You're going to want to use a medium acrylic block. This actually fits on there perfectly, but if you use a small one, it's going to be too small. So make sure you have the medium size for this. Take your ink, and you're going to ink this up just like you would any other stamp. You can do some rubbing motions if you want some additional texture on there. Some of that will show through. You can kind of see that. Otherwise, just dab. A few tips when using the pattern stamp. Sometimes it does help to stamp off of your piece of paper so that there's no definitive end to your pattern and it looks like it continues off of the paper. So you can see this paper is a little bit smaller than the stamp. And make sure you apply very firm and even pressure. All right, and there we have our first stamp for the pattern. The other thing that you can do is actually line up these edges with the edge right here to create a continual pattern down the paper. Just make sure you're lining them up so that it fits with the pattern. So you can see, in order to line up the pattern correctly, I actually had to shift the stamp over a little bit. So what you can do to fix that is come back in just with this one edge and stamp to correct the pattern. So you just line it up and stamp right along the edge. There we go. Next, we're going to go over stamping on textured paper. You can kind of see the texture that I'm talking about on this piece of cardstock. So we're just going to show you what it looks like to stamp on top of this. So let's get started. We're going to be using this citrus stamp because there are a lot of solid pieces on this stamp. And then just our black archival ink. Make sure to fully saturate your stamp so that there's no texture that's showing through from the pad on the stamp. All right, needs a little bit more on the top. There. Now we're going to stamp on the textured paper with firm, even pressure, and remove the stamp. So as you can see, some of the texture from the paper does show through on the stamp. This is not necessarily a bad thing. There are things you can do to use this in your favor if you're going for a more distressed look. There are a lot of situations where you would want this look, but just keep that in mind when you're stamping on textured paper. Some of the texture is going to show through, but we do like that look for some of the crafts that we do. Another fun way to create a pattern on your paper would be to take various elements from your stamp set and arrange them on a bigger block in a pattern that you like. Then you ink it up and just repeatedly stamp all over your paper. It's really easy. It adds a lot of fun patterns to your cards and some texture where you want it. So we're just going to take our black archival ink and ink up the pattern that we've created on our stamps. And then we're going to figure out where we want the first stamp to go. I think that looks nice. Again, we're going to stamp just slightly off the paper so that it doesn't look like the pattern abruptly ends at the edge of the paper. Push evenly with firm pressure. There's the first stamp. And now we're just going to repeat this process, moving this stamp collection across the paper. And one thing I like to do is rotate the stamp pattern as I go so that it's not all the same across the paper. But you do want to make sure that you're keeping about the same spacing when you stamp the second one. All right, and there we have our pattern paper. I think that turned out really pretty. You can see that this is the same paper that we used before, but this was the textured side, where you can see the texture coming through on the stamp. This was the flat side where you don't see any of that paper texture coming through. And the last thing that I want to go over is using embossing powder. So we have used embossing powder before in past videos. We actually did have an entire practice prompt dedicated just to embossing, so go check that out if you haven't looked at that one already. But today I specifically want to talk about clear embossing powder and the clear ink pad, because I think you can do some really cool things with this to create just a texture on your paper. I'm going to be doing it with a repeating stamp. So we're going to use our clear embossing ink pad and stamp along the bottom right here. And we're going to do this a couple times just to repeat the pattern. All right, and then I'm going to grab a scrap piece of paper and sprinkle the embossing powder on the stamps. Shake that off so you can see how the clear embossing powder stuck to the ink. Don't forget to always save your excess powder by pouring it back into the little bottle. Then we can set that aside and grab our heat gun. So you can see without even using a colored ink, we actually have a different shade of the green just by using the clear embossing powder and the clear ink. You can also see how it has a really pretty shine. So this is another way that you can add some texture to your cards, and I really like this technique. Thank you guys so much for watching. Today we covered two different techniques for creating a splatter pattern using pattern stamps, stamping on textured paper, creating a pattern with repeating stamps, and using clear embossing powder to add texture to your crafts. Be sure to come back for our next video. It's a continuation of this practice prompt where we will be putting all of this together to make a card. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.